The museum smelled of old wood and quiet, like pages of a book left open for centuries. Professor Elliot Marsh, gray-bearded and slightly hunched from years spent leaning over manuscripts, ran his fingers gently along the edge of an ancient oak table. It was warped with age, the grain of the wood raised like veins on the back of a wise hand. The placard beside it read, "Dining table, 13th century, recovered from a manor near Toulouse." He narrowed his eyes. A table? Just a table? No, it wasn't just that. This was the heart of a home, the stage of daily survival and celebration. This table had seen laughter, prayer, hunger, and perhaps even betrayal. It had held the weight of roasted birds and stale bread, the hands of peasants and nobles alike. Elliot leaned closer, his mind slipping through the centuries. He could almost hear the clatter of wooden bowls, the hiss of stew bubbling over fire, the low murmur of medieval voices. And then, something clicked. What if we've been wrong about it all? What if medieval meals weren't as bleak and joyless as we believe? What if, hidden in the stew pots of the past, there were flavors richer than history dares to tell? The vision overtook him before he could resist. He blinked once, and the oak table was no longer in a museum. It was set inside a warm, smoky room, flickering with firelight, and someone was calling for supper. Chapter 1. Of Ash and Roots, and the Peasant's Table. The village of Montclair was so small, it barely had a name. Nestled between two sluggish creeks and a copse of birch trees, it lay like a forgotten sketch on the canvas of southern France. Mud brick cottages huddled together for warmth, their thatched roofs like weary shoulders bowed under time. In one such home, where smoke coiled from the chimney and a pig grunted softly beneath the floorboards, supper was beginning. "Ma, I can smell it." A barefoot boy darted through the low wooden doorway, nearly knocking over a stool. "Aye, and you'll wait like the rest of us, Etienne," his mother scolded, stirring the cauldron above a lopsided hearth. Steam rose, thick and fragrant with garlic, parsnips, and something meaty. Etienne's older sister, Leah, sat on the floor grinding coarse salt with a flat stone, her hands raw from work. Their father, Jean, was outside cutting the last of the winter carrots from the frostbitten soil, his fingers black with dirt. Dinner was not a feast, but it was not misery either. The cauldron held a miracle, a rabbit caught in the traps that morning, its meat simmering with turnips, onions, a sprig of thyme, and the last of the barley. Crusty black bread, baked 2 days prior, sat wrapped in linen on the bench. A small wedge of cheese, speckled with blue, would be shared among the children. Outside, snow flurried in silence. Inside, the room pulsed with life. "Leah, fetch the trenchers," Ma said. The girl rose and placed thick rounds of bread onto the table. These weren't plates, not in Montclair. The bread itself would serve as both dish and final course. Jean entered, carrying carrots and a single leek. He placed them on the chopping block with a grunt. "The last of 'em," he said, wiping his nose. "Spring can't come soon enough." His wife nodded but said nothing. Her ladle moved in steady circles, the rhythm of a life built on repetition and patience. When the stew was finally ladled into the trencher breads, Etienne gasped in delight. The meat was real, not salted bits or bone scraps, real rabbit meat, browned and tender. "You've outdone yourself, love," Jean murmured to his wife. She gave him a look. "Say that again when you're scraping the pot." As they ate, the fire crackled. Leah broke off a chunk of bread, dipped it into the gravy, and passed it to her brother. The boy chewed with eyes half closed, as if tasting heaven. It was in this moment, this bite of warm broth, this shared silence, that something remarkable happened. Not a feast, not a famine, just a family, full enough to laugh. And it was Elliot, invisible in the corner of that memory, who now understood. They did not dine with silver forks, but they dined with honor. Chapter 2. Monks, Meals, and the Taste of Restraint. Far from Montclair, across fields stitched with frozen hedges and under a sky the color of steel wool, stood the Abbey of St. Brannock, carved into a hillside and shrouded in mist. The stone monastery had outlived kings and famines. It rose like a solemn hymn from the earth, unmoving, unbending, unwavering. Brother Aurelian stood barefoot on the cold stone floor of the refectory, hands folded over his worn woolen robe. Before him lay the silence of supper, not the kind that begged for prayer, but the kind that was prayer. Around him, other monks took their places without a word, their hoods casting shadows over faces carved by discipline and time. The long table stretched from one end of the hall to the other, a single plank of oak so ancient that it bore the marks of 1,000 elbows and 1,000 quiet meals. The light of beeswax candles flickered on the bowls, casting halos of gold upon the surface of the lentil stew. The scent was earthy, nothing more than boiled pulses, leeks, a touch of ground coriander if they were lucky. Salt was precious, meat was rare, and indulgence was sin. A bell rang. One note. The brothers sat. Another bell. They ate. No forks. Only spoons made of horn and wooden fingers. No talking. Only the sound of quiet chewing and the occasional cough echoing through the arched stone ceiling. It was not uncomfortable. It was not miserable. It was still. Brother Aurelian scooped lentils into his mouth with the rhythm of ritual. The bread beside his bowl was black and dense, made with rye and patience. It would last days before hardening to a weapon. He took small bites, letting the stew soften it. The texture was rough, like eating memory. Across from him, Brother Lucian closed his eyes as he sipped a broth spoonful, not in ecstasy, but in reverence. At the end of the hall, a younger monk stood on a raised platform and began reading aloud from the book of Ecclesiastes. His voice was clear, measured, not booming, not theatrical. The words drifted over the meal like steam. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. Each man listened while chewing. The word was not decoration here. It was sustenance. Aurelian felt the familiar warmth in his chest, the steady rhythm of a life pared down to its essence. There were no sauces, no roasted birds, no golden pies, but there was peace. Peace was a flavor, too. They ate their lentils. They drank ale brewed within the abbey's stone vats, low in strength, warm in tone. Their fingers clutched clay cups worn smooth by years of fasting and feasting alike. Not once did anyone rush. In St. Brannock, hunger was not an enemy. It was a teacher, and tonight, it was a gentle one. After the meal, the bowls were gathered in silence. The youngest monk wiped the long table with a damp cloth, as if cleaning an altar. One by one, the brothers filed out into the darkness of the cloister walkways, their sandals whispering against the stone. Brother Aurelian lingered a moment, staring at the empty bowls. He thought about the stories he had read of kings in faraway lands, men who dined on roasted swans stuffed with saffron and honey-glazed pears. He did not envy them, because the simplicity of his meal had left nothing to hide behind. No flavors to distract, no indulgence to dull the spirit, just the bite of lentils, the chew of bread, and the sacred rhythm of restraint. That was the point. In the stillness, he bowed his head and whispered, not a prayer of want, but of thanks. Behind the veil of time, Elliot Marsh observed it all from the silence between worlds. No longer did he think of monks as hungry. They had more than enough. In fact, they had something modern man had long misplaced. A full belly was not the same as a full soul. And sometimes, the emptier the plate, the richer the meaning. Chapter 3. The Feast of Lords and the Politics of Poultry. The castle rose like a judgment above the valley, stone stacked upon stone, crowned with pennants that snapped in the wind like tongues of fire. Below, the village bent to its will. Above, it watched with eyes of arrow slits and murder holes. But tonight, within the fortress walls, there would be no war, only wine. The dining hall of Lord Remigius of Verlow had been swept, scrubbed, and scented. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, and the massive hearth roared with an unrepentant flame. Above the mantel hung a tapestry depicting the conquest of a neighboring duchy, stitched in crimson and gold. its bloodless violence a warning dressed in art. The table was a monster, 40 feet long, carved from a single tree felled 3 winters ago. On it, a forest of dishes bloomed. Pheasants roasted in their own feathers, gilded with saffron and mustard seed. Trout wrapped in fig leaves and baked in clay. Tarts shaped like swans, spiced apples, orange peels soaked in honey, and almonds crushed into delicate marzipan towers. Nothing was plain, nothing was accidental. At the head of the table sat Lord Remigius himself, wrapped in furs and ambition. His beard had been oiled and curled, his fingers ringed with rubies and grudges. On his right sat his cousin, a baron from the coast; on his left, a bishop whose belly preceded his blessings. But it was not only food that fed this gathering. Beneath the silver plates and jeweled goblets swirled a stew of politics. Alliances, whispered betrayals, and the currency of favors. The servants moved like ghosts, trained to be invisible. One carried a platter of roasted capon, its legs tied with twine, its skin lacquered to the color of bronze. Lord Remigius sliced it open with theatrical precision. Steam rose, fragrant with sage and garlic. A gift from the Count of Beziers, he declared, his voice smooth as hot wax. His penance for last season's miscalculations. The bishop chuckled, plump fingers clutching a goblet of claret. A generous penance. May all errors be so delicious. The room laughed, but the laughter was sharp, like the crack of bone beneath velvet gloves. Across the hall, Lady Isolde of Montblanc watched with eyes like cold steel. She was veiled in deep blue, her hair braided with strands of silver thread. Her plate remained mostly untouched, though she moved food about with practiced grace. She was not here to eat. She was here to learn. Because every cut of meat, every course served or skipped, every toast raised or not raised, it all meant something. In the world of the nobility, food was power in edible form. The third course arrived, boar glazed with juniper and beer, its tusks wrapped in gold leaf. The bishop applauded. Now this, he said between bites, is a reminder of God's bounty. No, said Lady Isolde quietly. It's a reminder of who can afford to waste it. Eyes turned. The room chilled a degree. Lord Remigius raised his goblet, spoken like a true daughter of Montblanc. May your tongue always be as sharp as your wit. The moment passed, but not unnoticed. Meanwhile, in the corner near the minstrel's dais, a boy named Theo watched it all from behind a curtain. He was the kitchen steward's nephew, and this was his first night beyond the scullery. His job was simple: run messages between the cook and the butler, refill the water jugs, and stay out of sight. But Theo was learning faster than anyone knew. He saw which guests were given more meat, which were served last, which laughed too hard and which didn't laugh at all. He memorized the sequence of courses, the structure of the feast, like a poem made of appetite and performance. And he saw, most importantly, that the feast was not about food. It was theater. It was a battlefield. It was a chessboard set with bread and meat, and every bite moved a piece. Later that night, as the hall emptied and torches guttered low, Theo helped the steward gather the scraps. He stared at a half-eaten quail, its delicate bones splayed open like a murdered songbird. Don't look so sad, the steward said, dropping bones into a wooden pail. What they waste up here, we eat below. Theo nodded slowly. But I think they don't taste it. The steward paused, surprised. Then he smiled. You're right, they taste status, not stew. In the years to come, Theo would rise through the kitchens, then into the court. He would become a man who understood that the stomach is never just a stomach, and that hunger, in all its forms, rules men better than any king. Back in the present, Elliot Marsh pressed a finger to the glass of a display case in the museum's medieval wing. Inside sat an ornate pewter charger etched with symbols of House Verlot. Politics, he whispered, served medium rare, and he moved on. Chapter 4. Smoke and Spice at the Market of Bruges. The bells of Bruges tolled 7 times, low and sonorous. shaking pigeons from their perches atop the cathedral spire. A pale sun cracked through the morning fog like an egg into broth. And the city stretched awake with the sound of hooves, shutters, and yawns. At the heart of the cobbled labyrinth, the market square began to throb with life. It was not the kind of place where silence survived. Fishwives shouted over barrels of herring still wet from the sea. Butchers displayed cuts of pork with pride, each slice arranged like pages in a book. Carpenters offered rolling pins and butter churns. Children weaved through legs and baskets, their pockets sticky with plum preserves stolen or gifted. It mattered little. And then there was the food. Not the noble feasts of gilded halls, nor the humble stews of peasants. This was the cuisine of the in-between, of tradesmen, artisans, weavers, spice sellers, scribes, people who lived between dirt and silk. And today, it smelled like everything at once. Jasper, the baker's son, wheeled a cart of hot spiced rolls through the square. The steam rose in fragrant curls, cinnamon, nutmeg, dried currants clinging to golden crust. The coins in his apron jingled softly, but he cared little for them. What he loved was the sound his rolls made when broken open, a crisp crackle. Then softness, like waking from a good dream. Across the way, Anka the cheesemonger flipped her rounds of goat cheese, turning them like small white moons under the sun. She offered slices with honey for tasting. Beside her, Willem, a brewer with a bad leg and a good beard, tapped barrels of dark beer into clay mugs, the foam spilling like laughter. The center of it all was old Mother Elska. No one knew where she came from or how old she truly was. But her spice stand was the soul of the market. Dried cloves, saffron from the east, crushed pepper sealed in little linen pouches. She arranged them not by cost, but by story. This one, she said to a passing housewife, holding up a jar of deep orange powder, was worth 3 silver buttons and a kiss from a duke once. Or so he thought. People came for the food, but they stayed for her stories. A traveler from Genoa tasted her fig cakes and sighed, "This is better than the bishop's banquet." "To be fair," she replied, "the bishop has no teeth." In the midst of this riot of color and aroma stood a man named Elias. He was neither merchant nor monk, noble nor laborer. He was a scribe who had sold his books for bread, then learned that bread could tell better stories. Elias sat at a small table beside the herb sellers, sketching what he saw. A young boy biting into a sausage roll, cheeks puffed with bliss, a couple sharing an apple over laughter, a vendor slicing open a baked pear and sprinkling it with salt like a magician casting a spell. He dipped his pen into ink and wrote, "Here, in the gutters between kingdoms, people eat like kings, not with gold, but with hunger kissed by fire." Anka passed him a wedge of aged Gouda. "You'll write about me?" she asked with a smirk. "I just did," Elias said, mouth full. And behind them, a small drama unfolded. A baker accused a butcher of watering down his vinegar. They shouted in dialects so local they might as well have been spells. Elska rolled her eyes and tossed a handful of fennel seeds toward their feet. "May your tongue season your meat better than your mouth season the air," she muttered. Elias laughed. He loved this, not just the tastes and the smells, but the texture of life. In the market, food was not performance, it was presence. It was the daily defiance of death, celebrated with pie. As the sun climbed higher and the crowd thickened, the market square pulsed like a living heart. Nothing here was extravagant, but everything was enough. The food, the people, the scent of roasting chestnuts, and the warm beer. It stitched the community together better than any king's decree. From his place across time, Professor Elliot Marsh stood in the middle of the same square. Centuries later, notebook in hand, it was quieter now, cleaner, colder, carved into neat lines of tourism. No one shouted, no cheese cracked, no figs bled sugar in the hands of old women. But as he stood there, a breeze from nowhere carried the ghost of roasted hazelnuts and stale cider. He closed his eyes, and for just a moment, he was there again. The market had changed, but appetite never left. Chapter 5. Campfires and Brotherhood. Meals in the shadow of war. The wind howled across the plain like a mother who had lost her sons. It dragged ash and dust through the camp, lifting canvas flaps and curling around armor left to rust in the damp. Smoke bled from a dozen fires, thin, gray, reluctant. It smelled of wood not quite dry, meat not quite clean, and boots not quite dead. War was a noise that never truly stopped, even when the swords were sheathed. But tonight, for a few hours, the noise had quieted to the clatter of tin plates and the sigh of tired men. The camp of Lord Havard's company, roughly 80 strong, if you counted the one-eyed cook and the boy who limped after the horses, had settled on the slope of a ravaged hill. The men had fought that morning and would fight again at dawn. But now they ate, and they were grateful, not grateful for the food itself. It was little more than salted pork hacked into a communal pot, thickened with oats and rainwater, but grateful that it was warm, and that no one had died in the last 2 hours. Sir Galrin, once a knight of impeccable manners, now tore into his bread with cracked fingers and a missing molar. Hard as a priest's conscience, he muttered, breaking a piece off with his belt knife. Better than chewing your pride, grunted Bartok, his squire, who was already licking grease from his fingers. Across the fire, Captain Thorne hunched over his bowl, eyes half-lidded. He had killed 3 men before noon, bandaged a 4th, and buried a 5th. He hadn't spoken in hours, and no one pressed him. But when a soldier passed him a hunk of dried sausage, he nodded once. That was more than enough. The cook, old Malkin, stirred the pot with the same wooden spoon he used for nearly everything, food, threats, and once, interrogation. He muttered as he stirred, "If you want feast, go join the nobles. If you want to live, eat this and shut up." No one argued. The stew was mostly fat and salt, but it filled the belly and gave warmth to fingers frozen by steel and sorrow. A single onion bobbed on the surface like a drowned truth. Someone tossed in a sprig of thyme, dried and stolen from a monastery weeks ago. The pot hissed and sighed, like it remembered better kitchens. A boy named Wren, no more than 15, sat beside the fire, cupping his bowl like it was a newborn. He had only been with the company 3 days. He had not killed, yet, but his eyes already had the faraway fog of those who had seen something that stayed. "This stew," he whispered, "tastes like mud and bone." Sir Galrin chuckled. "That's because it is mud and bone." The laughter was hollow, but it was laughter. In war, that counted. Later, as the fires dimmed and the camp shifted into uneasy sleep, a handful of men lingered. They shared hard cheese, passed around a flask of mead so weak it tasted of regret, and spoke of things not allowed in daylight: home, women, dreams, silence. "I used to be a blacksmith," said Bartok suddenly, eyes on the stars. "Made plows, mostly, for spring." Galrin nodded, watching the fire eat the last of the wood. "I was a poet once, before I learned words don't stop arrows." The boy, Wren, looked from one to the other. "Do you miss it?" "No," Galrin said. "Yes," Bartok said, and the wind said nothing. That night, Elliot Marsh sat in his room at the inn near Caen, thumbing through an old soldier's journal he had found in an archive. Its cover burned, pages warped from water. One entry caught his eye, written in uneven Latin, translated roughly in the margins. "We shared stew under moonlight, and for 1 hour, we were not killers, but men. The fire did not judge us." He stared at the words for a long while. The food may have been poor, but the meal? The meal was human. Chapter 6. The Women Behind the Hearth. Grace in the Smoke. Long before the rooster crowed and long after the fire dimmed, the women moved through the kitchens of the medieval world like spirits in a sacred rite. Their hands bore the maps of their labor, calluses like old armor, burn marks like forgotten prayers, and their eyes, though soft, missed nothing. In a manor's kitchen in the heart of Normandy, beneath vaulted beams stained with centuries of soot, Agnes bent over a dough she had kneaded since dawn. Her elbows flared like wings as she folded and pressed. Folded and pressed. Her breath matching the rhythm of bread coming alive. She did not speak. She did not smile. She did not need to. The room was thick with scent, yeast and ash, rosemary and pork fat. Pots swung from iron hooks like pendulums of time. On the long wooden table, onions glistened, stripped and quartered. A pie crust waited for pigeon meat. A kettle rattled over coals. Stubborn and sputtering, Agnes was not alone. Beside her, Margot was chopping herbs with a blade so worn it had a curve like a sickle. She spoke to the parsley, not because she was mad, but because it helped her remember. 1 pinch for sweetness, 2 for mourning, 3 to keep death at bay. She had buried 2 husbands and 1 child. But the bread rose anyway. In the corner, a young girl stirred a pot taller than her waist. She was 10, maybe 9, named Bridget, and she could tell the difference between cow's milk and goat's just by smell. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes were full of fire. These were not royal cooks. They were not chefs by name, but they were the architects of survival, the mathematicians of scarcity, with no cold cellars and no clocks. They measured time in boils and browns, with no spices from afar. They conjured flavor from garlic, lard, and love. In peasant homes, they dug root vegetables from the earth like secrets. In castles, they planned meals like military campaigns. Who would eat? Who must not? What could be served to a baron that would not offend the visiting bishop? They knew how long bread lasted before mold set in, how to stretch a goose over 3 days in 4 mouths, how to make broth from bone and patience. They salted fish in wooden barrels and hung sausages in the rafters. They dried apples on straw mats and stored grains in sacks sewn from old tunics. They kept wine from spoiling with wax, and milk from curdling with ash. They preserved, fermented, stored, counted, not with abundance, but with devotion. But more than anything, they listened. They heard the creak of a rafter and knew the roof needed mending. They heard the silence of a child and knew she was sick. They heard the bubbling of a stew and knew it was too thin, too fast, too sharp. They heard the hunger in their husband's voice before he spoke it. And when the meal was ready, whether it was barley porridge or pheasant pie, it was they who served it with a glance that said, "Eat, live, I have done what I could with what little we have." There were no statues carved in their honor, no ballads sung for their broth, but their legacy lingered in every full belly, every warm room, every morning that began not with sword or sermon, but with bread. Professor Elliot Marsh stood in the reconstructed kitchen exhibit at the Chateau Museum in Rouen, staring at a row of clay pots behind glass. They had been discovered buried in a collapsed kitchen wall, untouched for 600 years. One still held the dried remains of rosemary. Another, traces of pig fat. He closed his eyes and imagined the hands that had touched them, stirred them, trusted them. Not queens, not saints, just women, keeping the world fed, one stew at a time. Chapter 7. Holy Days and Hunger Feasts. Rituals on the table. Snow dusted the eaves of the monastery like powdered sugar. The air held a reverent stillness, pierced only by the faint chant of distant voices echoing through the cloister. Inside the great hall of Saint Remy, rows of candles flickered along stone walls blackened by centuries of holy smoke. It was Christmas Eve, but this was not the kind of Christmas written in red ink in books of gold. There were no carolers with rosy cheeks, no toy-laden trees, no brandy-glazed hams. Instead, there was silence and fasting. For 40 days prior, meat had vanished from the tables. Butter was set aside, milk withheld, eggs forbidden. The monks had taken their meals in near penitence, lentils, dried peas, flatbread with no leavening, and broth made of roots pulled from frostbitten ground. Their hunger was an offering, their restraint, a bridge to the divine. But tonight, that bridge would touch heaven. Brother Matthew, the kitchen master, stood before the long table with the pride of a general unveiling his strategy. Though modest by royal standards, Tonight's meal shimmered with care and symbolism. Salted cod soaked and rehydrated. A pie of onions and dried figs. Honeyed wine spiced with nutmeg, procured in secret through a merchant from Venice. And the miracle of the night, a roasted goose. Blessed before the fire, skin bronzed and crackling. Each dish told a story, not just of flavor, but of resurrection. The cod, a sign of endurance. The figs, a sweetness earned. The goose, well, the goose was not just dinner. It was redemption in a crust of fat and forgiveness. Elsewhere, in a humble village church 3 days' ride away, the feast looked different. It was the feast of Saint Hildegard. Wooden tables had been dragged into the square, and old women laid out what little they had, a broth of cabbage, parsnips, and beans, loaves of nut bread tied with string, dried apples stewed with a spoon of honey saved all year. No one arrived in silk. The children wore patched cloaks. The men brought firewood as their contribution. But when the priest raised his hand and blessed the table, heads bowed not in shame, but gratitude, because today, they ate together, no one alone, and that alone was sacred. Across Europe, feasts marked the calendar not by royal decree, but by the turning of seasons and the rhythm of the soul. The harvest feast brought out the last of the root sellers, beets, turnips, squash baked in their own skins. The spring vigil meant fresh herbs and the first eggs of the year, boiled, dyed, treasured. Feasts were more than just food. They were memory performed. At the feast of St. Anthony, farmers led their pigs through the streets, decorated in ribbons, before they were slaughtered and served with pride. At Lent, kitchens grew quiet, as women whispered recipes for meatless stews and dried fruit compotes. At Easter, lamb reigned again, roasted over open flame, its bones cleaned and saved for amulets. These meals were prayers, eaten slowly, remembered fiercely, and for those who had nothing but crusts and broth, the feast still lived in the mind. The memory of one Christmas goose, one sweet loaf, one taste of mulled wine, that could last decades, could feed the soul through famine, could remind the hungry that joy, though rare, was real. Elliot Marsh turned the page of a psalter illuminated with miniature scenes of medieval feasts. Tiny men raised goblets beside gold leaf turkeys. But what struck him most was a margin scribble from a monk's hand. He who shares a meal shares his soul. He underlined the phrase gently. In a world where hunger was routine, and food was fate, the holy feast was not excess. It was hope, made edible. Chapter 8. From Soil to Spoon. The medieval food chain unveiled. It began in the dark, before the sun touched the hills, before the church bell stretched its first yawn across the valley. A boy named Alon plunged his hands into the frozen soil. The field was silent, still cloaked in mist, but already awake. Earthworms wriggled under his fingernails. His breath bloomed in the air like smoke from a poor man's fire. He did not yet know what time it was, only that the carrots were ready. The roots came up reluctantly, clinging to the earth like old secrets. Each one he pulled was a promise, of dinner, of trade, of coin, of survival. Miles away, in the pastures of St. Lo, a woman named Beatrix milked her goat with one hand and shooed away crows with the other. The milk would be poured into a clay jug, carried on her head for 2 miles, and bartered with the cheesemaker, who would turn it into soft curds by nightfall. In the forest, 2 hunters returned with rabbits slung over their shoulders, arrows still damp from the kill. They would skin and salt the meat before noon, and a trader would take it, wrapped in linen, across the valley to a village that hadn't seen fresh game in weeks. Each piece of food, each onion, egg, slab of salted herring, was not just an object. It was a traveler. It moved through hands, through homes, through mouths. It passed through mud and prayer, theft and forgiveness. It was taxed by lords, blessed by monks, dropped by children, stolen by cats. Nothing stayed still, not even grain. The miller's wheel turned with the force of the stream, crushing wheat into dust. From there, the flour was weighed, measured, and marked. The baker took it, kneaded it with hands tired from yesterday's batch, and shaped it into loaves that bore his initials, just in case someone complained. But most didn't, because even a flat, burnt loaf was better than hunger. And those who had nothing of their own, no goats, no fields, no mill, bartered labor for food. They hauled water, mended fences, swept straw from the tavern floor. In return, they received a bowl of stew, a heel of bread, sometimes a whisper of thanks. The system was not just economic. It was spiritual. To give food was to acknowledge someone's right to exist. To feed was to bind. To eat was to belong. And yet, it wasn't perfect. Lords took too much. Markets fluctuated like storms. Crop failures led to famine. And famine to death. But even then, people shared. A pot would appear at the door. A crust would be wrapped in cloth and left on a step. Hunger was the enemy, but not your neighbor. At the end of it all, the spoon hovered above the bowl. Simple, wooden, hand-carved by a grandfather for his daughter, now passed to her son. And in that spoon was the whole world, the farm, the trade, the market, the fire, the love, the sorrow, the journey from nothing to nourishment. Professor Elliot Marsh stood before a museum display titled Agricultural Tools of the Middle Ages. Most visitors passed it without stopping. It was just rakes, sickles, an old millstone. But Elliot saw something else. He saw a civilization that moved without wheels or engines, that fed its people with no plastic, no refrigeration, no global supply chain, only muscle and memory. And yet, they ate, not always well, not always enough, but always together. Chapter 9. Tables of Class. Where status sat beside salt. The sun began its slow descent behind the hills, casting a golden haze across the kingdom. Smoke curled from chimneys in crooked lines, and bells rang from distant towers, each chime marking the same moment across vastly different worlds. At that exact hour, early evening, when shadows grew long, 3 meals were served. 3 tables, 3 classes, 1 nation. The first table, the peasant's hearth. In the village of Vaupont, an old man named Jean knelt beside the fire, coaxing the last of the flame to life with a breath that rattled like winter leaves. His wife, Mireille, ladled cabbage stew into wooden bowls, scraping the pot with a flat spoon to make sure none of it went to waste. Their children sat cross-legged on the floor. No chairs, just the warmth of bodies close together. The meal was humble: boiled cabbage, a single carrot split 4 ways, and a crust of bread so hard it had to be soaked before biting. But the broth was rich with garlic and marrow, saved from a bone given by a butcher friend out of pity. Jean broke the bread, passed it to his son. "No meat tonight," he said. The boy shrugged. "Maybe tomorrow." They ate without complaint. Above them, herbs hung from the rafters like faded prayers. A pot of salt, nearly empty, sat beside the door like a forgotten jewel. Salt was precious, not just for taste, but for preservation, for trade, for life. Their meal ended in silence. Not sad, just quiet. The quiet of people too tired to speak, and too grateful to curse. The second table, the merchant's home. In a townhouse in Rouen, gilded just enough to whisper wealth but not enough to provoke envy. Master Claude, a textile merchant, sat down to a table dressed in linen. His wife, dressed in muted silks, poured wine from a green glass bottle imported from Bordeaux. The plates were ceramic, the forks, iron. The soup, made of lentils and beef stock, simmered with cloves. A roast duck glistened in the center of the table, surrounded by slices of quince, while a loaf of walnut bread steamed beneath a linen cloth. His sons took their seats with posture practiced, hands folded, eyes trained on their father. This was not just dinner. This was demonstration. "Today," Claude said, "we sold 3 bolts to the monks of Saint Denis, at full price." His wife smiled politely. The duck was carved, the wine poured. The conversation hovered between commerce and courtesy, avoiding politics and plague. There was no hunger here, only ambition. The salt at this table was imported from the south, white as snow, and served from a carved dish shaped like a swan. To Claude, it was not seasoning, it was proof. They ate with restraint, not for lack of food, but for the illusion of control. And when the dessert arrived, small honey cakes with shaved almonds, his daughter said quietly, "We are lucky, aren't we?" Claude did not answer, but his silence said yes. The third table, the nobles' feast. In the great hall of Castle Varnell, beneath banners faded by war and weddings, Lord Theobald Domont sat at the head of a table wide enough to seat 20. Only 8 were present. The rest had died. The meal was lavish by any measure: roasted pheasant, venison in wine sauce, buttered leeks, poached pears in cinnamon, a wheel of cheese cracked in half like a treasure chest. Pewter goblets glinted with claret. But there was no joy, only survival in velvet. Lord Theobald ate with mechanical grace, his eyes fixed on the flame, his mind still trapped in last month's siege. His steward had restocked the cellar. His cook had gone to lengths to impress. But the food did not matter. Not really. To eat richly after burying one's son was not luxury. It was penance. The salt cellar, shaped like a lion, remained untouched. At his right hand sat his last remaining heir, a boy of 12. Silent, pale, and picking at the skin of his quail. A future carved in the meat of the present. They dined like kings. And they grieved like men. Across all 3 tables, someone passed the bread, someone prayed, whether aloud or only in their mind. Someone wondered what the next meal would look like. And somewhere, far in the future, Professor Elliot Marsh stood before a digital display labeled Social Classes and Food in the Middle Ages. It was clean, informative, sterile, but Elliot knew better. He knew that to understand a people, one must look not at their wars or their wealth, but at their tables. Because a plate of cabbage, a wedge of duck, and a roasted quail, though worlds apart in value, shared one truth. All were eaten by hands that trembled. If you sat at their table, the museum was closing. A soft chime rang through the halls of stone and silence, reminding stragglers that history would be going to sleep now, behind glass. Beneath placards, under dim lights that mimicked candle flames but knew nothing of warmth, Professor Elliot Marsh remained, alone in the medieval gallery, seated on a bench before the reconstructed dining exhibit. A wooden table stretched before him, hand-hewn, scarred by time, set with replicas of bread trenchers, earthenware bowls, pewter goblets, and the faint scent of beeswax. It was not just a display. It was a mirror. He closed his notebook and whispered to the empty air, "If I sat at your table, what would you feed me?" He imagined the answer. If he sat beside Etienne, the peasant boy from Montclair, he would be handed a trencher of barley stew, hot and simple, no garnish, no excess, but he would feel full, not from the food, but from the laughter of a family who had nothing but each other. If he joined Brother Aurelian at St. Brannock, he would eat lentils in silence, taste the stillness between spoonfuls, and leave with a lighter soul than when he arrived. If he found a seat at Lord Remigius's banquet, he would be dazzled by the artifice of roasted larks and candied almonds, but feel a strange hunger beneath the abundance, an emptiness that the pheasant could not fill. At the marketplace of Bruges, he would eat on his feet, a honey roll in one hand, a pickled egg in the other, surrounded by voices and spice and chaos and life. And it would be the most honest meal of all. Beside the campfire with Galrin and Wren, his spoon would shake in his hand. The stew would be poor. But the brotherhood? The warmth of men who had seen too much and still chose to share what little they had. That would be unforgettable. In the kitchen of Agnes, he'd taste pigeon pie made from scraps and intention, and realize the strongest hands in the world are often the quietest. During a holy feast, he would eat slowly, reverently, and understand that to be fed in communion was to be reminded that life, though cruel, is still worth celebrating. And if he walked the narrow line between class and class, from farmer's hut to merchant's home to noble's hall, He'd find not 3 meals but 3 mirrors, each reflecting a different truth about fear, dignity, and desire. He stood now, adjusting his coat. The janitor passed by, nodding politely. But Elliot did not leave the way he came. Because now he knew. The food of the Middle Ages was not defined by ingredients or recipes. It was defined by intention, by context, by humanity. It was never just about what they ate. It was about what they endured to make it, and what they revealed in the way they shared it. So if you ever find yourself seated at their table, whether it be of oak, or stone, or imagination, do not ask what is for dinner. Ask instead, who am I breaking bread with? Because in the end, that is the only part of the meal that truly lasts.